She was in the living room when my nephew called. I remember the exact sound. The recliner creaking as she shifted, the television murmuring something about the weather in Phoenix. 41 years of marriage, and I still knew the sound of her settling in for the evening. I picked up my phone in the kitchen and stepped toward the window out of habit, the way I always do when I take a call I don't want her to overhear. My nephew works the front desk at the Marriott downtown. Has for going on 6 years now. He's a good kid, methodical, careful, not the type to make things up or stir the pot. When he called me that Tuesday night, his voice had a quality I hadn't heard from him since his father passed. Quiet, careful, like he was walking across ice and wasn't sure it would hold. "Uncle Ray," he said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to be straight with me." I told him to go ahead. "Is Aunt Nadine with you right now?" I looked toward the living room. I could hear the television. "She's in the other room," I said. "Why?" There was a pause that lasted too long. "She just checked in here," he said, "about 20 minutes ago. Room 614. She came in with a man. I checked her in myself. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was 63 years old, standing in my own kitchen, holding a phone, and the refrigerator hummed beside me the same as it always does." "You sure it was her?" I asked. "Uncle Ray," he said, "I've known Aunt Nadine since I was 9 years old." I told him I'd call him back. I set the phone on the counter. I walked to the doorway of the living room and I looked at my wife of 41 years, sitting in the recliner with a blanket across her lap. And she looked up at me and said, "Everything okay?" I told her it was just my nephew checking in. She nodded and turned back to the television. I went back to the kitchen. Now I want to be clear about something. I am not a man who panics. I spent 32 years as a structural engineer. I have looked at failing bridges and cracked foundations and load-bearing walls that should have given way and didn't. My entire career was built on the idea that you do not make decisions based on what you think you're seeing. You measure, you verify. You account for every variable before you draw a conclusion. That is not coldness. That is the difference between a building that stands and one that doesn't. So I stood in my kitchen and I thought carefully. My nephew had no reason to lie. He had every reason not to make this call at all. It would have been easier for him to pretend he hadn't seen anything, to let it go, to protect himself from whatever fallout might come. That he called me told me something. That his voice sounded the way it did told me something else. I also thought about the last several weeks. And when I did, certain things rearranged themselves. Nadine had started going to the gym in the evenings. She'd done this before. She goes through phases with it. But this time it was more consistent. 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. She'd come home a little later than the gym would explain. But I hadn't said anything because I hadn't thought anything of it. We are 62 and 63 years old. I was not looking for trouble. There had been a new cologne smell in the car once. I noticed it and then unnoticed it because my brain offered me a reasonable explanation before I could even ask for one. A friend's husband, maybe. A car ride somewhere. The mind is very good at protecting you from things you don't want to know. I called my nephew back. "What name did she check in under?" I asked. He hesitated. "Her own," he said. "Or almost. Nadine Hargrove, your last name." That was her name. I had not remarried. There was no other Nadine Hargrove. "How did she pay?" I asked. "Credit card," he said. "I don't know which one. I can't pull that up for you." I thanked him. I told him he did the right thing. I told him not to say a word to anyone, including his mother. After I hung up, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. We have a joint account and we have separate accounts. We've always been that way, even from early in the marriage. Her money is hers and my money is ours. That's how she always put it, and I used to find it funny. I went into the joint account first. Nothing unusual. Then I went into my own checking account and looked at the last 90 days. There were withdrawals I hadn't made. 7 of them spaced out over 10 weeks. Each one under $500. Cash, ATM withdrawals, different machines around the city. The amounts were small enough that I wouldn't have flagged them on their own. Taken together, they added up to just over $3,000. I sat with that for a while. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. I did not sleep. Nadine came to bed around 11. She read for a while. She fell asleep with the light on, the way she always does, and I reached over without thinking and clicked it off, the way I always do. My hand knew exactly where the lamp was. 41 years of muscle memory. I lay in the dark and I thought about what a structural failure actually looks like. It's almost never the dramatic collapse you imagine. It's almost always small things, over time, in places nobody thought to look. A hairline fracture, a slow shift in load distribution. The building looks fine from the outside, and then one day it doesn't. I went to see my doctor the next morning, not for a medical reason. My doctor, Sheldon, has been my friend for 22 years. We play golf badly together every other Saturday. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. I told him I thought something was wrong at home, and I needed someone to talk to who wasn't family. Sheldon listened. He is a good listener. When I finished, he said, "What do you want to know for certain?" I told him I wanted to know who the man was. He said, "Then you need to find that out before you say a single word to her. Because the moment you say a word, whatever you don't know yet, you'll never know." That was good advice. I've always trusted Sheldon's advice, even when I don't like it. I started paying attention in a different way after that. Not frantic, not obvious, just attentive. The way you look at a structure you've started to doubt. Methodically, without flinching. She was careful, I'll give her that. There was nothing overt, no second phone, no obvious change in behavior. Nothing that would have alarmed a person who wasn't already alarmed. But when you know what you're looking for, small things become visible. She started keeping her purse closer. She had always been casual about it, left it on the counter, on the hall table, sometimes on the floor by the door. Now it came upstairs with her at night. I noticed. She became slightly more attentive toward me, more solicitous, a little warmer. Not enough to seem out of character, just enough to feel like maintenance. Like she was keeping the relationship running smoothly so I wouldn't have reason to look at it too closely. I have seen that exact behavior in people who are managing a problem they haven't told you about. Engineers do it with projects that are going sideways. I recognized it. On a Thursday night, about 10 days after my nephew called, she said she had her book club. She's been in the same book club for 14 years. The women meet on Thursday evenings, the third Thursday of the month. This was the second Thursday. I said, "Have a good time." I kissed her on the cheek. I watched her back out of the driveway. Then I got in my own car and I followed her. I am not proud of that, but I did it. She drove to a neighborhood about 20 minutes from our house. Newer construction, nice enough. She parked in front of a house on Elm Grove Street and she sat in the car for a moment. Then she went inside. The lights were already on. I parked half a block down and I waited. At 9:47, she came out. A man walked her to her car. He was about my height, maybe 60, maybe a little younger, gray at the temples. They talked for a moment. Then she hugged him. Not a quick hug, the kind that means something. I waited until she pulled away. Then I drove home a different route and I was there before she was. When she came in, I was in the kitchen making tea. She said, "How was your evening?" I said it was quiet. She said the book was good this month. I asked what the book was. She told me, some novel I'd never heard of, and I filed that away too. That night I couldn't eat. I sat at the table and moved food around my plate, and she asked if I was feeling all right, and I said I thought I might be coming down with something. She put her hand on my forehead the way she used to do with our kids and said I felt fine to her. I thought, you don't know what fine feels like anymore. The next morning I drove back to Elm Grove Street. In the daylight, it was just a quiet street. I wrote down the address. I called an old colleague of mine who'd moved into real estate law after we both retired. I asked him, purely as a hypothetical, how you'd find out who owned a particular property. He walked me through it. Public records. County assessor's website. It took me about 10 minutes. The house on Elm Grove belonged to a man named Douglas Witten. I didn't know that name. I had never heard Nadine mention it. I typed it into a search engine and a LinkedIn profile came up. Retired, financial sector, widower. Moved to the area 3 years ago. 3 years. I thought about the last 3 years. Nadine had joined a different gym 3 years ago. She'd started volunteering at the community center about 2.5 years back. Small shifts that I had accepted as the natural texture of a retired woman's life. She'd always been active. I'd always been glad she had things that were hers. I kept that to myself and I kept watching. I went back through our finances more carefully. I hired a CPA I'd worked with years ago, told him I was reviewing some accounts for estate planning purposes and needed a thorough look at cash flow over the past 3 years. He was thorough. He found patterns I hadn't caught. Small cash withdrawals from my accounts going back 26 months, always under 500, always spaced apart. Over 3 years across 2 accounts I had access to, the total came to just over $14,000. $14,000. Not a fortune, but it wasn't nothing either. And it had been done carefully, in a way that was designed not to be noticed. I sat in the CPA's office, and I looked at the numbers laid out on paper, and I thought, this was not impulsive. This was planned. This was someone who was thinking ahead. I went home that afternoon, and my wife was in the garden. She was wearing the blue hat she wears when she's pulling weeds, the one that used to belong to her mother. She looked up when I came through the gate and smiled at me, and for a moment I just stood there looking at her. 41 years. 2 children. 5 grandchildren. 4 addresses across 3 states. The house we live in now, we chose together. The kitchen we remodeled, we argued about for 3 months over the countertops and then laughed about it for years afterward. I taught her to drive a stick shift in an empty parking lot when we were 24. She sat with me every night in the hospital when my father was dying. I know the sound of her breathing when she's asleep. I know which side of the bed she sleeps on and why, because the window is on the left and she likes to feel the air. I know all of this, and I was also standing in the garden looking at a woman who had been slowly taking money out of my account for 2.5 years. I said, "How's the garden?" She said the tomatoes were coming in. I said, "Good," I was glad. I went inside. I spoke to our daughter that weekend. She lives about 2 hours away, and I drove up to see her alone, which I never do. She knew immediately that something was wrong. She gets that from me, the ability to read a room before anyone says a word. I told her everything. All of it. The call from her cousin, the hotel, the man on Elm Grove Street, the money. She didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I said, "About 3 weeks." She said, "And you haven't said anything to her?" I said, "No." She looked at me the way she used to look at her brother when he was being unnecessarily stubborn. Then she put her hand over mine and said, "What do you want to happen?" I told her I didn't know yet. I told her I wasn't ready to decide what I wanted to happen until I knew what had actually happened, until I had the whole picture, because I have seen what it looks like when you make structural decisions on incomplete information, and I was not going to do that with 41 years of my life. She said, "Okay." Then we figure out the whole picture. My daughter is very much like me. It is not always a comfortable quality in a child, but in that moment I was grateful for it. Over the next 2 weeks, with her help, I built out what I could. My nephew at the hotel confirmed she had been in that hotel 4 times over the past 8 months, always with the same credit card, always in the same room category. My daughter found Douglas Witten's social media. He wasn't private about it and worked backward through posts to establish a rough timeline. He'd been photographed at the community center where Nadine volunteered. She was visible in the background of one photo from about 2 years ago, standing near him, laughing at something off camera. 2 years. I had been married to this woman for 41 years, and she had been lying to me for at least 2 of them. Maybe more. Maybe I was only seeing the edge of something larger. I didn't know. I still don't know everything. What I knew was, I had enough. I chose a Sunday morning. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She had made coffee, the way she always does, and the paper was on the table, and the whole scene looked so much like 41 years of Sunday mornings that it made something in my chest tighten in a way I hadn't expected. I sat down across from her. I set my phone on the table between us. I had pulled up the hotel reservation records my nephew had photographed for me, and the bank statement with the withdrawal highlighted, and one photograph, the one from the community center, where you could see both of them in the frame, and something in the way they were standing made the nature of it clear without requiring explanation. She looked at the phone. She didn't say anything right away. "I've known for about 5 weeks," I said. "I haven't said anything because I wanted to understand the whole picture before I said anything at all." She looked up at me. I said, "I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. I'm not going to interrupt you. I'm not going to raise my voice, but I need the truth." And then she did something I was not prepared for. She started to cry, not performatively, not the way people cry when they're trying to manage a situation. The real kind. The kind that comes from somewhere low and doesn't have a strategy behind it. She told me it had started about 2.5 years ago. She told me she'd been lonelier than she'd let on, that retirement had been harder for her than she expected, that she'd felt invisible in ways she didn't have language for until she met someone who made her feel seen. She did not defend what she'd done. She said that several times. She did not defend it. I asked about the money. She put her hands flat on the table. She said she had been setting it aside, in case she decided to. She hadn't decided to, she said, but she'd wanted to have the option. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Did you think about asking me?" She said she didn't know how. 41 years, I said. "And you didn't know how to talk to me?" She said, "You're not always easy to talk to." I didn't have a response to that. I don't know if she was right or wrong. Maybe both. We sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The coffee went cold. The Sunday paper sat unopened. At some point, the neighbor's dog started barking at something and then stopped, and the street went quiet again. I am 63 years old. I have built things and I have watched things fall. I know that when a structure fails, the question is never just whether it can be saved. It's whether saving it is the right thing to do, whether what you'd be saving still serves the purpose it was built for, whether the foundation can bear the weight again. I do not know the answer to that yet. What I know is this: I am not going to make a decision in the middle of the damage. I am going to take the time I need. My daughter calls every few days. My nephew checks in. Nadine and I are still in the same house, in separate rooms now, which was my choice, and she did not argue with it. Some mornings I come downstairs and she is already in the kitchen, and I pour my coffee, and we do not speak for a while, and it is not comfortable. It is also not nothing. 41 years is not nothing. I stood at the kitchen window this morning and watched the light come up over the backyard. The tomatoes she planted are growing. That seems like the wrong detail to notice, but it's the one that stays with me. She is still tending the garden. I don't know what that means about anything. I only know that I am not going to rush toward a conclusion I'm not ready for. I spent my whole career learning that the most important decisions deserve the most time, and I am too old and too tired to start making exceptions to that now. The coffee is hot. The morning is quiet. I am still here, in the house I chose, in the life I chose, trying to figure out what I'm choosing next.